Sometimes the truth doesn't come in with a bang or a scream. Sometimes it slips in quietly, wrapped in the trembling hands of someone you thought you knew, and it changes everything. I remember that night as if it were pressed into my bones, the way the hospital lights flickered just a little too harshly, the way the air felt heavy with things unsaid. Ernest was sitting up in his bed, his shoulders hunched, his eyes darting to the door every time it creaked open. He was a proud man, the kind who tried to keep his dignity, even as illness chipped away at it piece by piece. But that night, there was something different in the way he looked at me. There was a question in his eyes, a silent plea for honesty, for comfort, for something real in a world that had started to feel unreal. I'd seen that look before, in different faces, over decades of night shifts and endless days. It's the look of someone who knows they're being kept in the dark, who senses that the people they love are hiding something from them, and who is desperate for a sliver of truth to hold on to. The halls were quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that makes every sound echo. I could hear the distant beeping of monitors, the soft shuffle of slippers on linoleum, the low murmur of nurses exchanging stories at the desk. I'd been through nights like this more times than I could count, but there was a weight in the air that I couldn't shake. Ernest's family had been visiting more often, their voices hushed, their eyes red-rimmed. His daughter, Lisa, had always been the strong one, her back straight, her words measured, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. But that evening, when she walked through the door, I saw her hands trembling around something she clutched to her chest. It wasn't flowers or a book or any of the usual comforts families bring to a hospital room. It was something else, something that made my heart stutter in my chest before I even understood what it was. I stood there, frozen for a moment, the tray in my hand suddenly feeling too heavy. I watched as Lisa hesitated at the threshold, her eyes darting to her father, then to me, as if she was searching for permission or maybe for courage. Ernest looked up, hope flickering across his tired face, and in that instant, I knew that whatever she was carrying, it wasn't just an object. It was a secret, a truth that had been hidden from him and from me until now. I've seen families torn apart by secrets, seen love twisted by fear and pride, but I've also seen the way a single moment of honesty can heal wounds you thought would never close. That night, I realized I was standing on the edge of one of those moments, and I wasn't sure which way it would go. My name is Gloria. I've spent more nights in hospital corridors than I have in my own bed. I've held hands through pain, whispered comfort in the dark, and watched more sunrises from a nurse's station than I can count. I thought I'd seen every kind of heartbreak, every kind of miracle. But when I saw what Lisa brought into that room, when I saw the way Ernest's world shifted in an instant, I understood that there are still moments that can shake you to your core, no matter how many years you've lived or how many stories you've carried. Some nights, the truth is heavier than any burden, and some secrets, once revealed, change the shape of a family forever. That was the night I learned that even after a lifetime of nursing, there are still things that can make your heart freeze in your chest and remind you just how fragile we all are. That evening had crept in softly, as evenings in hospitals often do, the sun slipping behind the gray skyline while the fluorescent lights inside hummed on with their clinical glow. I remember being at the nurse's station, my old hands sorting through medication charts, listening to the subtle symphony of a hospital settling into its nightly rhythm. Every shift has its own rhythm, its own breath, and that night the air was thick with anticipation, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I'd worked countless night shifts over the decades, but there was something about that one, something quiet, restless, almost mournful. The staff was smaller at night, and you could feel the difference. There was Margaret, tending to the wound care in room 12, humming softly to herself, and young Ryan, still new enough to flinch at the sound of a sudden alarm. I saw them moving through the halls, their faces a mixture of fatigue and duty, bound by the unspoken camaraderie that only those who work the darkest hours can understand. I'd been assigned to the East Wing that night, a wing where the rooms are a little older, the lights a little dimmer, and the stories a little heavier. Ernest was in room 23, a corner room with a small window looking out at the parking lot, a view that, at night, became little more than a reflection of the dimly lit interior. I'd gotten to know Ernest over the past few weeks. He was a man who clung fiercely to routine, who liked his tea just so, and who never complained, even when the pain was etched so clearly across his face. There was a quiet dignity to him, the kind I'd seen in men who have lost much but refused to let the world see their sorrow. He reminded me so much of my own father in his later days, the way he would straighten his back when someone entered the room, the way he tried to protect his family from the heaviness of his illness. That night, I remember pausing outside his door, listening to the soft murmur of voices inside. His family had been coming more often, filling the small room with whispered conversations and the scent of worn leather jackets and hand lotion. His daughter Lisa was there most evenings, sitting by his side, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She was the anchor, the one who asked the doctors the hard questions, the one who tried to keep everyone else afloat. But even the strongest anchors can be worn away by the tides of worry and grief. I saw it in the way her shoulders sagged when she thought no one was looking, in the way her laughter was just a little too forced when she tried to lift her father's spirits. As the evening wore on, I checked in on my other patients, Mrs. Barbara, who always asked for her favorite blanket, and little Carter, a boy with eyes wide as saucers, fighting a fever his mother couldn't soothe. There are moments, in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, when the hospital feels like a world unto itself, a place where time stretches and contracts, and the only thing that matters is the next breath, the next heartbeat. I could hear the distant sound of a lullaby playing from a pediatric room, the low drone of the television in the waiting area, and somewhere, the soft, ragged weeping of someone facing a truth they cannot change. It was during those rounds that I felt the pull back to Ernest's room, a gentle nudge from somewhere deep in my chest. Maybe it was the way he had looked at me earlier, or maybe it was just the instinct that comes from years of watching families teeter on the edge of something irreversible. I paused at the door, listening once more, and realized the voices had faded. Lisa was alone now, sitting quietly, her father dozing lightly, his breath uneven. I stepped inside, offering a gentle smile, and she looked up at me with eyes that were bright with unshed tears. There is a language between nurses and families, one built not on words but on glances, on the simple act of being present. I sat with her for a moment, letting the silence settle, offering her the comfort of company, if not answers. In those quiet moments when the world outside the hospital walls seemed so far away, I felt the weight of all the stories I'd carried over the years, and I wondered what new story was about to unfold before me that night. Hospitals have a certain way of holding their breath after midnight, as if the walls themselves are waiting for something to happen. That night, as I quietly moved between rooms, adjusting blankets, checking IVs, and whispering small encouragements to those who couldn't sleep, I felt the heaviness of the silence settle over me like a familiar shawl. I've always believed that the night shift has a different kind of intimacy. It's when the bravado fades and people allow themselves to be vulnerable. Patients, families, even nurses. You see the truth of people's hearts in those hours when the rest of the world is asleep and it feels like you're the last guardian on the watchtower. I could feel Ernest's presence at the back of my mind, tugging at me each time I walked by his door. With each pass, I noticed little changes, a new card from a grandchild on the windowsill, a different scarf around Lisa's neck. The way Ernest's gaze would linger on the shadows, as if searching for something he'd lost. These small details accumulate in a nurse's memory. They become a quiet record of hope and loss, the things we notice and the things we wish we could fix. Lisa was always polite, but I could sense her exhaustion. The way she sat, always on the edge of her chair, her hands restless, told me more than any words ever could. She'd ask about her father's medication, about the doctor's rounds, but there was something she wasn't saying. I'd seen it so many times. The fear of saying the wrong thing, the dread of hearing the truth spoken aloud. Ernest was sharp. He noticed the sideways glances, the half-finished sentences, the way his family grew quiet whenever he asked about home. He'd try to catch my eye when I entered, searching for answers in my expression, hoping for something the others wouldn't tell him. And I, in turn, tried to offer reassurance with a touch to his shoulder, a steadying smile, a moment of quiet conversation about something other than illness. My other patients that night were each fighting their own battles. Mrs. Barbara, so frail, asking for her favorite blanket, needing her pillows fluffed just right. Little Carter, eyes burning with fever, his mother pacing the room, desperate for a sign that the worst had passed. I moved between them, as I always do, trying to bring a touch of peace to each bedside, but my thoughts kept returning to Ernest and Lisa. I saw the way Lisa clung to her purse, how she checked her phone and then tucked it away as if she was hiding from some message she didn't want to read. The heaviness around that room grew thicker as the hours wore on. During a rare quiet moment, I found myself at the window at the end of the hall, looking out at the city lights. They reminded me that life was continuing outside, that people were laughing in their kitchens and children were falling asleep to bedtime stories, blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding within these walls. I wondered about all the secrets kept in hospitals at night, the truths whispered or withheld, and the courage it takes to face them when morning comes. I've learned that sometimes all you can do is be present. Sometimes that's enough, and sometimes it isn't. It's a lesson that never gets easier, no matter how many years you wear the uniform. If you've ever spent a night in a hospital, either as a patient, a visitor, or a caregiver, you know what I mean. There's a kind of fellowship in those quiet hours, a silent understanding that we're all holding each other together, if only by the thinnest thread. I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? Has a hospital ever changed your life or the life of someone you love? Please share your story with me. These walls hold more than medicine and machines. They hold the memories and hopes of everyone who passes through. Sometimes, in the stillness of the night, I think about all the stories that have unfolded here. Stories of heartbreak, of hope, of families holding on to each other when everything else seems to be slipping away. It's in these moments that I remember why I chose this life and why, even after all these years, I still find meaning in every quiet hour, every whispered prayer, every hand I've held through the darkness. There's always a moment in every shift when the fabric of routine tears just enough to let something raw and unexpected through. I felt it before I saw it, an unease that prickled the back of my neck as I finished my rounds and made my way quietly back toward Ernest's room. The air outside his door was thick, almost buzzing, with the kind of tension that comes when a family stands on the edge of a truth they can't hold back any longer. I paused for a moment, my hand hovering just above the doorframe, listening to the muffled voices inside. I could hear Lisa's voice, tight and trembling, and the deeper rumble of Ernest's, trying to sound strong for his daughter's sake. But there was a quiver there, a sound I'd heard in so many fathers, husbands, and sons over the years. It was the sound of a man bracing himself for pain, not the physical kind, but the ache that comes from secrets slipping into the open. When I stepped in, the room felt smaller than ever, as if the walls were pressing closer to witness what was about to unfold. Lisa was standing by the foot of the bed, clutching a small, worn box to her chest. Her knuckles were white, her breathing shallow. Ernest looked at her, his brow furrowed, his hands twisting the edge of his blanket. I could feel their fear radiating off them in waves. In that instant, the years I'd spent as a nurse weighed heavy on my shoulders. The nights I'd sat with families as they revealed devastating diagnoses, or long-buried regrets, or hopes they were almost too afraid to name. Lisa's voice cracked as she finally spoke, her words barely above a whisper. She told her father there was something he needed to know, something she and the rest of the family had kept from him because they were scared of what it might do to his heart, both literally and figuratively. I watched Ernest's face as the words washed over him, saw the mixture of relief and betrayal, the desperate longing for the truth, even if it hurt. Lisa's hands shook so badly I thought she might drop the box, but she held on, as if that little object contained every ounce of courage she had left. I stepped closer, feeling the old ache in my knees, the echo of 1,000 similar moments I'd witnessed over the years. I knew this was the turning point. Whatever was inside that box, whatever words were about to be spoken, would change the course of Ernest's story forever. My heart pounded in my chest, and I found myself holding my breath alongside them, silently willing the moment to pass gently, for the truth to land softly, even though I knew it rarely does. In those seconds, time stretched, and I saw not just a father and daughter, but every family who's ever struggled to protect each other from pain, only to find that love means facing it together. It's strange how familiar this scene felt, and yet how it always hurts anew. No amount of experience can dull the rawness of a night like that, when the ordinary routines of a hospital shift give way to the extraordinary courage it takes to tell the truth. I stood at the edge of that room, bearing witness, and in my heart I hoped that this moment, painful as it was, would one day be remembered not just for the sorrow it brought, but for the healing that could finally begin. The storm had arrived, and all any of us could do was hold on. The memory of that moment has never left me, and I know now more than ever that some truths can't be hidden forever, no matter how hard we try. I remember the way the light flickered above Ernest's bed, the way Lisa's breath caught as she opened the box, and how the world seemed to narrow down to that single fragile moment. It was as if the hospital itself was holding its breath, waiting for the words that would change everything. And in that silence, I felt the weight of every secret I'd ever witnessed, every family I'd ever comforted, pressing down on my heart. That's the burden and the blessing of this work, to witness the breaking and the healing, to stand in the space between what was and what will be. That moment, when the truth starts to claw its way out, never comes clean or easy. It's messy, always. As Lisa's trembling fingers pried open that small, battered box, I could feel the tension in the air squeeze tighter, making the room feel like it was shrinking around us. Ernest's face showed a flicker of confusion, then fear. He was bracing himself for something he couldn't name. In all my years, I have seen that look 100 times, but it never stops hurting. There are some wounds that no medicine can soothe, only time and honesty, and even then, the scars run deep. Lisa's voice shook as she told her father about the test results they'd kept hidden, the real diagnosis the doctors had whispered to the family but had never said aloud in Ernest's presence. She was desperate not to break him, desperate to hold together the pieces of her father and the family she'd been trying so hard to protect. Ernest listened in silence, his breathing uneven. I saw his hands tremble as he reached for the box, his pride fighting with his terror. The box itself was nothing special, one of those old keepsake tins people used to store letters and photographs. But inside, I saw the edges of papers and the familiar blue of a hospital document, folded and refolded so many times the creases had nearly worn through. There were photographs, too, tucked in among the papers, snapshots of happier times, reminders of a life lived fully, and perhaps a silent plea for hope. My mind kept flashing back to all the families I'd watched fight over how much to tell, how much to hide, convinced that love meant sheltering their loved ones from the worst. But the worst always finds its way in, eventually. Lisa's tears spilled over as she confessed the truth about his condition, a prognosis far more serious than he'd been led to believe, a future his family had tried to soften out of desperation and love. Ernest's face crumpled, the pain of betrayal mixing with the pain of the news itself. I could almost feel his heart breaking, not just from the illness, but from the realization that the people he trusted most had been keeping the world from him. As a nurse, you become a keeper of secrets, a silent witness to the private wars fought behind closed doors. But you also carry the burden of watching those secrets unravel, of seeing the fallout when trust is broken. I stood at the edge of the room, my own heart aching, wanting to step in and protect them both, but knowing that this was a storm they had to weather together. The monitors beeped, relentless and cold, reminding us all that time does not stop for heartbreak. I watched Ernest's chest rise and fall, each breath a battle, the silence in the room thick enough to drown in. I saw Lisa reach for her father's hand, her own shaking, and for a moment the two of them sat together in a silence so deep it felt sacred. Lisa pleaded, telling him that all she'd wanted was to give him hope, to spare him the fear. Ernest's eyes filled with tears, his pride warring with his need for comfort. He asked questions, his voice shaking, desperate for details, for some small piece of control. Lisa answered as best she could, her voice barely more than a whisper, her whole body trembling from the weight of what she had carried alone. It was painful to watch, not just the revelation, but the years of unspoken worry, the nights of sleeplessness, the heavy cost of love paid in silence. I thought of all the families I'd seen in this same position, all the hearts I'd watched break and sometimes mend. I wanted to tell them both that there is no perfect way to protect the people we love, that secrets never save us from pain, they only delay it. But I knew my words would be useless in that moment. All I could do was stay, bearing witness, holding space for their pain, and praying that they would find their way through. That's what nursing is at its core. Not just healing bodies, but standing beside people as they break and sometimes as they find the courage to begin again. If you've ever held a secret or had one kept from you, you know that ache. Please, if this story touches you, I hope you'll share your own experience below. Subscribe if you find comfort in these stories. Maybe, just maybe, telling them will help us all carry our burdens a little lighter. And if you have a story of your own, I hope you'll share it so we can remind each other that even in our hardest moments, we are never truly alone. After the storm of confession, there is a hush that falls over a hospital room unlike any other. That night, after Lisa's trembling voice gave way to sobs and Ernest's questions ran out, I watched the silence settle gently around them. I've seen this so many times before. The moment when the truth, no matter how heavy, finally lands and everyone draws a breath, realizing the world is still turning, even as their own has shifted on its axis. Lisa sat with her father, her hand resting atop his, and Ernest stared at the box in his lap, the weight of new knowledge pressing down, but also, strangely, a kind of relief beginning to peek through the grief. The monitors continued their soft beeping, a metronome for the slow return to ordinary time. I stood quietly, present but unobtrusive, feeling the ache in my own chest ease just a little as the worst of the storm passed. In those moments, I always marvel at the resilience of the human spirit. Ernest, who just an hour before seemed so fragile, began to ask the practical questions. What comes next? What treatments were possible? How much time might be left? The pain of betrayal was still there, but now it mingled with hope and the need to make use of whatever time remained. Lisa wiped her eyes and answered as best she could, the two of them beginning the slow work of rebuilding trust, brick by brick, word by word. It's never easy, this process of mending what's been broken, but I've learned over the years that families find a way, more often than not. I offered Ernest a cup of tea, just the way he liked it, and he took it with a nod of gratitude that said more than words could. Lisa let out a long breath, her shoulders dropping as if she'd set down a burden she'd carried for miles. As the minutes ticked by, the room became calmer. The air felt lighter, as if the truth had cleared away a fog that had been suffocating them both. I checked Ernest's vitals, and though his heart was still weak, his spirit seemed steadier than before. Lisa began to talk about her own children, about the memories they still wanted to make, and Ernest managed a soft smile that broke the tension. I stood back, letting them find their new footing, knowing that sometimes the best thing a nurse can do is simply bear witness and let the healing begin at its own pace. The hospital around us continued its quiet work, nurses changing shifts, janitors mopping floors, the distant ring of a phone at the nurses' station. But in that room, for just a little while, there was peace. Nights like that remind me why I keep coming back, even after all these years. The pain and fear are real, but so is the courage, the forgiveness, the love that endures even after the hardest truths have been spoken. There's a kind of sacredness in those moments, a lesson in the way families come together, no matter how messy the journey. The storm had passed, and in its wake, there was a quiet strength settling in. I watched as Lisa and Ernest began to talk about the future, not just the treatments and the appointments, but the small things like favorite meals and old family stories, the things that make life worth living, even when the days are uncertain. The storm had passed, and in its wake, there was a quiet strength settling in. I watched as Lisa and Ernest began to talk about the future, not just the treatments and the appointments, but the small things like favorite meals and old family stories, the things that make life worth living, even when the days are uncertain. I saw the way Lisa squeezed her father's hand, promising to be honest from now on, and the way Ernest, despite the pain, nodded in acceptance. In that room, I felt the weight of years, my own and theirs, lifted, if only a little, by the simple act of facing the truth together. And as I looked at Ernest and Lisa, I felt a deep, abiding hope that they would find their way, just as so many others had before them, and just as I hoped I would when my own storms came. That is the quiet miracle of these nights, the healing that begins not with medicine, but with truth, forgiveness, and the promise of another sunrise. After the storm of confession, there is a hush that falls over a hospital room unlike any other. That night, after Lisa's trembling voice gave way to sobs and Ernest's questions ran out, I watched the silence settle gently around them. I've seen this so many times before. The moment when the truth, no matter how heavy, finally lands and everyone draws a breath, realizing the world is still turning even as their own has shifted on its axis. Lisa sat with her father, her hand resting atop his, and Ernest stared at the box in his lap, the weight of new knowledge pressing down, but also, strangely, a kind of relief beginning to peek through the grief. The monitors continued their soft beeping, a metronome for the slow return to ordinary time. I stood quietly, present but unobtrusive, feeling the ache in my own chest ease just a little as the worst of the storm passed. Sometimes in the quiet after such a tempest, there is a kind of grace that settles in, a sense that something real has been faced and survived, even if the scars are still tender. In those moments, I always marvel at the resilience of the human spirit. Ernest, who just an hour before seemed so fragile, began to ask the practical questions. What comes next? What treatments were possible? How much time might be left? The pain of betrayal was still there, but now it mingled with hope and the need to make use of whatever time remained. Lisa wiped her eyes and answered as best she could, the two of them beginning the slow work of rebuilding trust, brick by brick, word by word. It's never easy, this process of mending what's been broken, but I've learned over the years that families find a way more often than not. I offered Ernest a cup of tea just the way he liked it, and he took it with a nod of gratitude that said more than words could. Lisa let out a long breath, her shoulders dropping, as if she'd set down a burden she'd carried for miles. As the minutes ticked by, the room became calmer. The air felt lighter, as if the truth had cleared away a fog that had been suffocating them both. I checked Ernest's vitals, and though his heart was still weak, his spirit seemed steadier than before. Lisa began to talk about her own children, about the memories they still wanted to make, and Ernest managed a soft smile that broke the tension. I stood back, letting them find their new footing, knowing that sometimes the best thing a nurse can do is simply bear witness and let the healing begin at its own pace. The hospital around us continued its quiet work, nurses changing shifts, janitors mopping floors, the distant ring of a phone at the nurses' station. But in that room, for just a little while, there was peace. Nights like that remind me why I keep coming back, even after all these years. The pain and fear are real, but so is the courage, the forgiveness, the love that endures even after the hardest truths have been spoken. There's a kind of sacredness in those moments, a lesson in the way families come together, no matter how messy the journey. The storm had passed, and in its wake there was a quiet strength settling in. I watched as Lisa and Ernest began to talk about the future, not just the treatments and the appointments, but the small things like favorite meals and old family stories, the things that make life worth living even when the days are uncertain. I saw the way Lisa squeezed her father's hand, promising to be honest from now on, and the way Ernest, despite the pain, nodded in acceptance. In that room, I felt the weight of years, my own and theirs, lifted, if only a little, by the simple act of facing the truth together. And as I looked at Ernest and Lisa, I felt a deep, abiding hope that they would find their way, just as so many others had before them, and just as I hoped I would when my own storms came. That is the quiet miracle of these nights, the healing that begins not with medicine, but with truth, forgiveness, and the promise of another sunrise. Sometimes the biggest change doesn't come with a crash, but with a gentle exhale, a silent promise, and the courage to keep moving forward. As the hours slipped away and the hospital settled into its quiet, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened, tracing each step back to that trembling moment when Lisa entered Ernest's room with the box pressed to her chest. I remember the way my own heart froze, how time seemed to slow as I watched father and daughter face the truth together. All these years as a nurse, I thought I'd grown used to the rhythm of heartbreak and healing, to the constant dance between hope and despair. But that night reminded me that some stories never lose their power to shake you, no matter how often you stand witness to them. Some nights, the lessons come back to you with a force you can't ignore, and you realize you're still learning, still growing, even after a lifetime spent in the company of pain and hope. In the days that followed, I saw Ernest and Lisa settle into a new kind of honesty. There were tears, of course, and hard conversations about treatments and time, but there was also laughter, the soft, relieved kind that comes when a burden has finally been put down. Ernest's family began visiting with a new openness, no longer whispering in the hallway or averting their eyes when he asked questions. They spoke about memories, about the future, about fears and dreams that had been locked away for too long. I could see the change in Ernest, too. The weight of secrets had been heavy, but the freedom of truth seemed, in its own way, to lighten his steps, even as his body remained frail. There was a gentleness in his voice, a willingness to forgive, and a gratitude for the time that remained, however uncertain it might be. I think back to that moment, the one that began with Lisa's trembling hands and ended with a silence full of love and forgiveness. I realize now that what froze my heart that night wasn't just fear or worry. It was witnessing the raw courage it takes to face the truth when it would be easier to keep hiding. I've seen so many families torn apart by what they could not say, held together by what they dared to admit. And I have come to believe that every family, at some point, must walk through a night like this, A night when the truth is laid bare, when secrets lose their power, and when forgiveness, though slow, begins to heal what silence has wounded. It is in these moments, when we are stripped of all pretense, that we find out what love really means. It's not about protecting each other from pain, but about holding each other through it, about being brave enough to be honest even when it hurts. In my long years of nursing, I have learned that there is a kind of grace in surrendering to these moments. We cannot always protect the people we love from pain. Sometimes, the best we can do is stand with them, steady and unflinching, as they find their own way through. That is what I did for Ernest and Lisa. That is what I try to do for every patient, every family, every night I walk these halls. Because in the end, life is made of these moments, not just the big, dramatic revelations, but the quiet, ordinary acts of courage that happen when we choose not to turn away, no matter how afraid we are. I hope that if you ever find yourself at the edge of a truth, you'll remember that you are not alone, and that healing begins the moment we let go of secrets and let love do its work. That is the lesson I carry with me, and the one I offer to you with all the tenderness of a nurse who has seen both the worst and the best of what it means to be human.